Hello, I'm Elijah Rose, the soldier turned historian, and today's topic is again the legendary origins of the Arab people. This fourth part being about the background of Abram and Sarai. Abram was a man with an Akkadian name, but sources say he was from the Sumerian town of Ur. This was also a period in history when all personal names carried explicit meaning, and Abram means exalted father, but he would later change his name to Abraham, which means father of many. Now, this is a strange name to give one's son, or for a then childless man to give himself, but the etymology might work out that the Hebrew for father comes from Abraham and not the other way around. It's also not surprising he has mixed Akkadian and Sumerian origins, as the early Bronze Age in Mesopotamia, those cultures were indistinguishable from each other, as it was one culture of nomads along the river, and across the Bronze Age, they would become more settled, and in the medieval period, a distinction between the North and South would form, and but these would later be reunified under the king of Akkad, who lived in a city at or near modern Baghdad. Abraham would have grown up roughly during this region's unification period. Now, according to a legend recounted in the Jewish Midrash, Abraham was the son of an idol maker in Ur. The custom at the time was people would offer food as sacrifices to these idols, but when no one was looking as part of a teenage rebellion, Abram would actually mock these idols. Later, Abram would smash these idols, and when caught, he claimed the idols fought each other over the sacrifice he offered them. Of course, no one believed him, but Abraham just took this as proof that everyone secretly knew the idols were useless. And so he left Ur with his wife and his brother and became a nomadic herdsman. And as he moved across the Fertile Crescent, he picked up a number of employees with his wanderings. It cannot be stressed enough. The exact size and composition of the Abram clan is unknown, but he had varying amounts of employees, and he also had relatives and friends with him as he moved, and he got richer as time went on. So it can only be assumed the group started small and ended fairly big. Also, despite being considered the founder of current monotheism, Abram is said to have actually known nothing about God. He simply tried to do the right thing. This is important to understand because he had several strange behaviors that actually were not even allowed in the cultures he helped create. Abraham's wife was Sarai, which means princess, but Abraham would later change her name to Sarah, meaning God's princess. As they moved across the Fertile Crescent and got richer in form of cattle, eventually they'd end up in Egypt, and Abram feared bride stealing. He thought gangsters might kill him and kidnap his wife. Now, of course, this is because he was not familiar with Egyptian politics at the time, so their solution was to simply introduce Sarah as Abraham's sister and not his wife. We don't have confirmation for this, but I suspect the pharaoh at the time was Ramses II, aka Ramses the Great, aka known as to the Greeks as Ozymandias. And if it was not him, it was one of his immediate successors that fought for the throne after he was dead. It's very difficult to know which pharaoh most of these sources are referring to because they're always just referred to as pharaoh. Probably because Ramses literally means the son of God, and most pharaohs had highly pretentious throne names like that they chose for themselves and demanded people call them. Now, this particular pharaoh was accustomed to, quote, marrying any woman he wanted, regardless if they were willing, and Abraham was a potential political ally because he could act as the pharaoh's proxy abroad. Now, sources don't say why Sarah didn't speak up immediately, or if Sarah and the pharaoh had slept together, but what they do say is that without even bothering to tell Abraham, the pharaoh went to an impromptu marriage ceremony and, quote, married her, only to immediately find out that she was in fact Abraham's wife and not his sister, turning the matter from a standard operating procedure for Egypt at the time into a political scandal. Of course, Pharaoh raged at Abraham at length, angry about what he did, at misleading him and creating this issue, but he did actually return Sarah unharmed and gave Abraham many gifts in the forms of animals and gold. This misadventure had made Abraham a very rich man, and his wealth would only continue to grow as he reinvested it. But he actually used a lot of his money to cover his wife in shiny jewelry, as was the custom in the Bronze Age. So if you get an image of Sarah as being covered in bronze and gold jewelry, head to toe. After this, Abraham went back to Canaan, and he took a woman named Hagar with him. Now, Hagar is highly unlikely to be her birth name, but there's a chance that the etymology of this word comes from the woman's name and not the other way around, because it's said to have meant something like runaway, immigrant, or even prize. And prize is what the Achaeans, according to Thucydides and Homer, is what the Achaeans called their sex slaves, and they were traded as such. And yes, this was contemporary, roughly, with the Trojan War, but all we know for certain is that Hagar did not initially join with Abraham for that purpose. And it is also not clear when Hagar got that name or why. The Midrash made an offhand remark about Hagar, saying she'd, quote, rather be a slave in Sarah's house than a mistress in her own. And the book of Jasher says that she was Pharaoh's daughter. It's impossible to be sure of what all that means, but it is definitely very bad. Well, for starters, in Bronze Age cultures, the difference between a slave and an employee was whether or not they chose to work for their master. All servants had the same legal status as the master's children. They lived in his house, and the master was obliged to take care of them. The Midrash appears to be referring to something that was common knowledge when it was written during the Roman periods of Judea, but that knowledge is simply now lost to us, because it implies that there was sex abuse within the Egyptian royal family, and that's why Hagar was running away to be a servant of Abraham. But all we really know for certain is that Hagar becomes Sarah's personal servant, often referred to as handmaiden in translations, and she accompanied her wherever she went. Of course, years later, Abraham was thinking about settling down in Canaan permanently and becoming a landlord. He was living somewhere in the Hebron area at this time, and his lack of a successor became a bit of an issue. Sarah at this point was mid 70s and Abraham was mid 80s, and of course, they both thought Sarah was well past childbearing years. Now, it's unclear whose idea this was, but their solution was Hagar would become a surrogate mother for Abraham's child. This becomes to set the stage for perhaps the biggest conflict of historiography in all human history, the births of Isaac and Ishmael, and the matter of Abraham's succession, which will become the topic of next video.